Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Access Granted, the reality of compromised credentials in a passwordless world. Let's get started. Okay, so on this call, we're going to have Chip Witt, who's our VP of Product Management, Trevor Hillegloss, our Director of Security Research, and I'm Colette Tomaszek, Director of Product Marketing. Today, we're going to go over what we'll cover. We'll give you some context on who SpyCloud is and what our overall mission is focused on, covering some trends in the password problem, the added layers of authentication, and overall what that path to passwordless looks like. And then we're going to go over myth versus reality and go into detail on what you need to know about that landscape, the evolution of passwords to help you for cyber attacks and essentially fortify your enterprise. So at SpyCloud, we're really focused on solving a big problem. And what it is that criminals profit from stolen data about your organization, about your customers. And it's a huge problem on a scale that's really hard for teams to digest and manage on a daily basis. Our mission at SpyCloud is to stop that from happening, to really ensure that we equip you and your teams with the information, context, insights you need to protect your business from malware infections or ransomware attempts and just data breaches by taking our recaptured data and turning it around on the criminals. So this enables your teams to act quickly whenever an enterprise or customer data is compromised, and you can get ahead of these cyber attacks. And what that looks like, it's really more than just threat intel. With SpyCloud, what we're looking to do is introduce cybercrime analytics, where all of our products are built around our cyber analytics engine. And it's really there to address the problem set that you encounter when you're trying to use lower or core darknet data. That's not just to learn or gain context, but to really take action and protect your business when it actually matters the most. So our engine here on the left side is where all of that recaptured data from all of those layers of the darknet is collected. It's then curated, it's enriched and analyzed to drive our products that automate protecting your business so you can take action on that data. And one of the reasons that other vendors don't work with some of that lower or core layer is because of its raw data formats. It's overwhelming and it's not even unstructured data. It just comes in a variety of broken databases or broken data structures, and it's often in binary or mixed formats at massive scales. So our engine specializes in figuring out when that raw data is and how it can be used to protect you, parsing, curating, so it then can be ingested into our core data set. So our engine also invests heavily in cracking and analyzing passwords and other PII assets, and that results in almost 90% of passwords being provided in plain text in our products. And access to these data elements allows us to perform analysis and create relational links between those different elements we have, producing actionable insights to protect your business. And then if you look on that right side of the slide, this is essentially the output of our engine, the use cases that we enable for enterprises. And our engine is leveraged by our products and the APIs in automated protection use cases. And this includes everything from ransomware protection, account takeover protection, online fraud. And we also support cybercrime investigations with access to our data set. So overall, SpyCloud is really focused on leveraging this analytics engine that's built to provide you with the industry's deepest and broadest data set that is collected extremely early in that cycle of crime and that is automated to actively protect your business. So let's dive into the core premise of the webinar. And we're going to kick it off with the password program, which I'm going to pass over to Chip.
Yeah, so the password problem, I think one of the things that's really interesting about the password problem is it probably more than anything provides really interesting insight into the human condition. One of the things that you see in terms of this, because there's a human portion of it that's very, very important, there's also the criminal ingenuity focuses on those human weaknesses. What do we talk about when we talk about human weaknesses? Well, first of all, users tend to prioritize ease of use and convenience over security. And so they choose passwords that aren't necessarily the smartest passwords. They're usually linked to things that they know and can remember easily. Even if they have a recurrent password reset hoisted upon them as part of enterprise policy, they tend to pick passwords and lists of passwords that they can continue to reuse over and over. And that's where password reuse comes in, is it's not just in the enterprise environment that people tend to reuse those passwords. They have over 200 online services, if they're average people, that they're logging into and authenticating most often, most frequently by way of password. And so remembering passwords, if you change them and make them unique for every distinct site, becomes a problem the headspace can't deal with. Humans don't have that kind of capacity. So you see a 72% password reuse rate is what we saw in breaches over the last year. And that's just because humans typically will reuse passwords across all the sites. My favorite kind of throwback to remember is the LinkedIn breach. Everybody and their brother was in the LinkedIn breach. They all got the word from LinkedIn to change their passwords, But what they didn't do is change it on the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Instagrams, and all the other services on which they were using that exact same password. Criminals knew this and leveraged it by virtue of just sort of adapting to that particular problem. People also tend to use things that are socially relevant. And that's actually one of the really interesting things. We do a password exposure report every year, and it shows that people use real life events to make commentary on their particular stance on those issues or their favorite sports or entertainers as part of their password. That's interesting, considering that nobody else should know your password. So why would you use that as commentary? But nonetheless, we see this habitually in human behavior. So very, very important to recognize that password fatigue is inescapable because of the pervasiveness of the need for passwords. But for criminals, this human element is of tremendously high value, and they leverage it at every turn to pull out the low-hanging fruit and make good use of that, profiting off of that particular problem with people's habits.
Okay, guys. So what about password managers?
So after hearing that, Chip, I think that the natural next step is, okay, well, we use a password manager. And just to kind of level set before I get into this slide, that's fantastic. Password managers are great, right? We at SpyCloud, big fans. Anything that's going to make it harder for the adversary and pose kind of risk in this case. We'll talk about the consequences later, but that's good, right? Those are good things to start doing. The important thing to note there is it's not foolproof, right? These things that we come up with to protect our enterprises, to protect ourselves, they're fantastic when used properly, but our research has shown that A, they're not always used properly, and B, even when they are used properly, there still are vulnerabilities that exist and need to be managed. So this, up here on the screen, the 118,000 master passwords that we found, a couple of things to note. We only looked for 8 password managers. There's a lot more than 8 password managers out there. So if we had expanded our scope, I expect we would have seen more master passwords. The other thing that this really suggests, going back to kind of the human element of this, so if you're familiar with how browsers work, right, you kind of have your in-browser password manager. Say, you use Google Chrome, use the Google Chrome password manager, or some other application and its own password manager. And then the password managers that we're talking about are the ones that are kind of layered on top of that. So these are different companies that produce a secured vault, enable you to log in with one password and create randomized passwords for all your different services. The fact that we're seeing those master passwords indicates that there's crossover, right? So even though people are using these external password managers that are themselves quite secure, recent news might say otherwise, in at least in some cases, but they are secure in what they do. They do it very well. But once you start overlapping, it almost is like password reuse, right? Going back to that last slide, you're using the same master password for your password manager, but you're also saving that password inside of your browser, or you're using it in your autofills, or even worse, that master password is something that's used as a regular password for various sites. So the problem that arises is now you're giving the criminals access to that vault. So even if you're doing things like making randomized passwords, you're using the password generation function that's often built into those to generate a different password for each of the logins. If you have that master password as a criminal, that gives me access into that vault, which means it's now even worse, right? Because even though you're not sharing those passwords across all of those services, they are different. the vault itself is a shared password, right? By dint of that master password. So by gaining access to that vault, that criminal then has access to basically your entire, online infrastructure, be that a corporate environment or a commercial, residential environment. So just because you use password managers, you still have to control for user behavior. And some of the kind of recommendations there are make sure that that master password is used only as that master password, right? That shouldn't be anywhere else. The way that I like thinking about this is choose something unique but complicated. Choose like a sentence or something. Add some special characters in there so it's a little bit more random, but make it memorable. Then you don't have to write it down. It doesn't have to be something that's used on multiple services. And the other thing is pick one password manager and stick with it, right? If you're going to use an external password manager, use that. Don't use that and then save your password manager in the browser's built-in manager, right? We're crossing different applications. We're widening our risk vector in doing that.
So on that, it feels like password is an issue. Password manager still isn't foolproof. So then all those additional added layers that we're looking to either authenticate that identity. Do you guys want to talk about what that landscape looks like and where it's heading towards passwordless?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. And we get questions on this all the time. The security field is constantly adapting, right? We've seen massive changes just over the past 5 to 10 years, and it seems like maybe it's even speeding up in terms of the kinds of things that we're coming out with to keep ourselves safe, which is fantastic. This has kind of caused me to reevaluate the way that I think about this. So now, we used to think about credentials as being like a username and a password, right? Or maybe your email address and a password. Authentication now is kind of much more broad, right? Authentication, maybe it's like a time-based one-time password, right? Everybody's had those sites where you don't really have a password. You just put in your email and it sends you a code and you log in with that code, or, it redirects you to a link that's time-based. There's physical tokens out there, right? So things that you physically plug into your device and that stores the cryptographic material on that physical token that is used to authenticate. The new thing that has come out recently, and we'll talk about a little bit in future slides, is fully passwordless. So this uses like some combination, so usually like biometric fingerprint or a Face ID or something like that in place of your password. But the thing to remember here is it's all authentication, right? Regardless of how that session is authenticated. The point from the criminal perspective is that there was a session that has been authenticated. And we'll get into kind of why that's really significant now. But, whatever kind of part of the web that you're looking at on screen here you fall into, just remember that we're talking about authentication, and that access is what's really important here. Okay, so on that note of kind of focusing on the access, that is almost in and of itself a layered experience, right? So you think about like, let's say I have a multi-factor authentication on my GitHub, right? So I enter my username, my password, it prompts me with a multi-factor code. Once I enter all of that, I get a authenticated session, right? There is a cookie that's created on my device that uniquely identifies that device as having logged into that application successfully, and that's time bound, and there's importances there. But you can kind of split that up into multi-layers, right? There's like the login attempt itself with that traditional username and password. There's the multi-factor attempt, right? Using that, password or multi-factor authenticator app, or, maybe it's like a physical token or whatever. And then the last one there is kind of the assignment of that session cookie, right? And that kind of has the longest life in terms of the actual user activity, even though it's not something you really see constantly in the background. Your browser, every time you click on a different, link on that website, your browser is constantly communicating with that server to verify that it is still authenticated. Otherwise, it's going to kick you back out to the login prompt, right? So the point of that is, whether we're talking about the first stage of that, the actual login attempt itself, the multi-factor, whether that can be bypassed or not, the cookie, really all of this is access, from the perspective of the criminal and how they talk about this online. They're talking about that as a means of access. So I have access into company X, or I have access into X number of accounts on this service. They don't really care, quite honestly, what that access is. It might be an RDP access into a device, right? It might be an established session that has a very long cookie, long-lived cookie that's going to be active for maybe hours, days, weeks. The point is that access exists and that it can be used for malicious purposes. And that's really what the criminals are after, because that leads to the next phase, whether that next phase is something malicious just in and of itself, or much more commonly, monetization, right? Fraud, committing either theft or some other form of fraud to gain the criminal money.
So if access is how they make profit, what are the odds that with passkeys being another form of access for a user, criminals are like, wow, that is really complicated. No, thanks. I'm good. I have enough revenue. What does that look like?
Well, yeah, from the beginning of time, that whole access problem, the fundamentals of it haven't changed all that much. What has changed is the mechanics or the technical aspects of it. And so right now, from a bypass of authentication, there are entire ecosystems that are dedicated to stealing cookie data specific to bypass authentication, to leverage MFA, trusted device tokens that bypass MFA entirely. That is still a big part of what people are doing, all in terms of this mechanism. So as we move towards passkey and passwordless, that problem doesn't change. There's still going to be cookies that are looking to bypass authentication. So if criminals get access to that, they can get rid of the problem entirely and not have to worry about having the token or having a password or any of that. There's also the very real criminal activity of stealing recovery passwords. And Trevor already spoke a little bit about this, is that a lot of services home run back to a password to reset that device. So if you lose a device or you change devices, or something happens that fundamentally breaks or has to be upgraded, you still have a password. Password managers still have a central password. And so that data is still of high value if criminals can find a way to get it. So a lot of those human elements that we were talking about earlier, those bad habits around security hygiene, are still leveraged by criminals to get access to probably what could be considered even more sensitive passwords, because they unlock the keys to the entire castle. And the third piece here is that, and more in line with what I think Colette was asking just a few seconds ago, is as the technology evolves, so too do the criminal capabilities, innovation around that. Criminals are very smart. They look for low-hanging fruit, but as technology changes, that fruit changes. And so they're looking for different things on devices. And we've actually seen evidence of this already, that criminals are beginning to explore ways that they can leverage tokens off of devices and take that information. So actually, rather than me talking about details and high hand-wavy motions on this slide, let's go on to the next slide. And Trevor, can you give us a little bit more insight into what criminals are actually doing?
Yeah, and I think that last call out is fantastic, right? In the research community, we talk a lot about sophistication. That's like a buzzword, right? The actor sophistication, but it's really I'm guilty of as much as the next guy about talking about sophistication. Just to be clear, but really it's kind of a bit of a logical fallacy, right? Because while things, we on the blue side, we build tools, we make it harder for the actors, and you might think, kind of just sort of have a logical exercise there, that it being harder means that only those really sophisticated actors are going to be able to do it. But that's actually wrong, because what's going to happen is the sophisticated actors are going to build tooling that the low sophistication actors are going to use without having to fully understand it, right? Just like, we think about cookie bypass. Well, if you were to say like, hey, there's no tools, you need to figure out how to do cookie bypass yourself. I mean, that might be a difficult problem, but that's not the problem, right? There are dozens, if not hundreds, of open source tools, browser frameworks, that allow you to do that, and it's already built for you. You basically have to have no coding experience whatsoever, just the ability to click a mouse and Control V, Control C a couple times, Control C, Control V. That's all that it takes, right? So reframing this into, it's not so much actor sophistication. There is certainly a timeline there that maybe that there is a bit of lag, but very, very quickly, those actors are going to adopt what we have, conquer it, and then build tooling for others to do the same. So I just really wanted to touch on that real quick because I think that's an excellent point.
The other thing too is it's also an economy, right? That's a fundamental word that I see on this slide. It's not, actors doing things as singletons. They've built an entire economy dedicated to this problem.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the cybercrime ecosystem deserves a webinar of its own. But you only need to look as far as look at all the malware as a service that we've seen pop up over the past 10 years or so, maybe closer to 9. But malware developers that are very, very good at what they do, putting out malware, they're not deploying it. I mean, some of them might be here and there, but really the scheme is that some person somewhere is going to build malware and then sell that to other people who are going to use it, right? Look at the ransomware affiliate. I mean, there's so many examples of this. It really is the commodification of cybercrime, and it is kind of the bring it to the masses, as you alluded to, right? And the same is true really for this, right? For kind of going to passkey implementation. One of my biggest concerns, and again, I just want to state, this is great, right? It's good that we're doing this. We need to be introducing these things. This does make it harder for the adversaries. We're not saying don't use passkeys, right? We're not diminishing the great work that's been done on passwordless, but it does have some significant issues. And the recovery is one of those significant issues, in my opinion. So currently, as it stands today, June of 2023, this might be different tomorrow. But all of the current implementations still require some use of a password, right? So whether that's setting up the account itself, or as the case in what we're talking about here, recovering that passkey. There was a few months ago, I listened to a podcast where they had one of the co-founders of YubiKey on. And he was asked, I forget his name, but he was asked something along the lines of, so my enterprise has just moved to YubiKeys. We've bought YubiKeys for all of our employees. What should we do next, right? And his answer was, buy a second YubiKey. And obviously, there's some bias there, clearly.
Marketing 101, right?
Right, exactly. But the point he was trying to make was, what happens when somebody loses a YubiKey? I mean, YubiKeys are fantastic. That's great. But you have to have some means of recovering that authentication. We can't just throw our hands up and say, well, I guess that employee doesn't work here anymore, right? Sorry, Bob, you lost your YubiKey. I hope you have good luck finding your next job. We still have to find some way to get that person access to their accounts. So what that turns to in a lot of cases is either some human being, an IT worker that can manually reset a passkey, or maybe they can grant access using a temporary code or something, or some traditional method of reset, right? Get a code to your email and then respond to an MFA prompt, or use your password that you created when you created that account along with some other function, and then we'll give you access. We'll renew those tokens. So that itself is a large vulnerability. And again, it goes back to the whole convenience factor, right? We can't just say, well, sorry, Bob, right? We got to make some way for Bob to get access to his stuff again. And therein lies the security risk, is that kind of fungibility of the security in pursuit of convenience. So the last one here, we've talked about bypassing the authentication altogether. I think we've beaten that one to death. We talked about stealing a recovery passwords, or making malicious use of that recovery process altogether. But the physical passkeys themselves, a bit of a misnomer there, but the passkeys, or the private key, seed key, whatever you want to call it, that generates that passkey, they are also not invulnerable, right? We're talking about data that is stored somewhere. The private key typically is stored locally on the user's device. Well, even if it's encrypted, it's still able to be stolen, right? And we've seen that. It depends on the implementation, but oftentimes it's encrypted using either the master password itself, or maybe some other password that the user created. It's on the device. It's prone to being stolen by malware. So going back to your point about criminals being ever adapting, if a criminal can't bypass or steal a recovery method, well, they're going to have to steal the passkey. And I, in the experience that I have and the years that I've spent in this career field, I will say that there's one truth that is self-evident amongst all others, and that is that criminals are ultimately and infinitely adaptable. So if that is what has to happen, I have absolutely zero doubts that the criminals will find a way to do it and sell it, make it a commodity.
So with all that contextual education on what's happening in the space, I think it's still fair to make sure we address the myths and go over what that reality looks like when it comes to passwordless. So one of the first myths is MFA is good enough. But the reality is that MFA is still susceptible to bypass. Chip, Trevor, expert advice.
Yes.
Yeah, it's still susceptible to bypass. That's absolutely certain. And I think we talked a little bit about this already, right? Is one of the primary ways that I'm aware of, and Trevor can correct me if I'm wrong here, is info stealing malware is still a great way to basically harness the power of human fallibility and get access to the information that's going to bypass authentication, including trusted device tokens in form of cookie, and bypass MFA entirely. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I mean, I think the obvious kind of way to take this is to the authentication app side, but I want folks to remember that it's, while the authentication apps certainly are used, email-based MFA, SMS-based MFA. I mean, these are things that still exist, right? And we see time and time again that they fail. An attacker is oftentimes going to target an email account first for various reasons, but chief amongst them is because they know that they can recover passwords using email, right? And oftentimes it's just email. You don't even need an app. SIM swapping is still a problem that we deal with in 2023 all the time. And SIM swapping this is exactly why SIM swapping happens in many cases, right? Is to bypass SMS-based authentication. So it's good. It's better than not having any other factored authentication, of course. But it truly, in this world today, is not good enough.
Yeah.
What drives that good enough? Because you hear that often, like it's good enough for what I need until something bad happens, or it's good enough for XYZ. What can we do to advise people to kind of escape that false sense of security almost in MFA, or just overall in general for security, where good enough isn't really just checking the box good enough going to protect you at all times?
Yeah. Anytime I hear MFA, I leap to the cookies, because of one thing that I see is still prevalent in a lot of applications is you're logging into a web-based application that requires MFA. Good on you. You're doing the right thing. But then you have a little checkbox that says, remember this device for X number of days. Oops. Right? That's when the cookie gets written, right? You check that box and you put in the 2FA token, and then that device has a token that is remembered for that number of times, whatever, like it's 15 days or 30 days, I think is really common. The criminal has a way to scoop that information up. They're basically bypassing MFA in that way. And I leap to that because we talked about, convenience. Convenience always trumps security. And so that's one of I don't have to do a SIM swap. I don't have to do any of the more difficult technical challenges to get around it. I can just harvest that information because users are doing it.
And to your point, like what can enterprises do? I mean, I think Chip's point is incredibly poignant, right? Like limit those cookies time to live as much as you possibly can. It's going to impose some burden on your employees, on your users, of course. But I would humbly submit that the slight bit of burden that is imposed is vastly outweighed by the risk to all the bad stuff, ransomware and all the other things. So that's like fantastic. Please do that. Some of the other things you can do is like be very considerate of MFA. Not all MFA is created equal. I mentioned email and SMS as the boogeyman, right? But really evaluate what you're using for MFA. Can you actually tie that MFA itself to a device? A lot of MFA providers are now actually doing that, where you can establish a trusted relationship between that app and the device. So even if somebody were to be able to steal that seed or be able to emulate that in some way, it's going to make it even harder, right, for them to bypass that. But the other side of that goes back to the recovery method. So don't just look at how you're doing the authentication, look at how you're doing the recovery. So look at what is that little box below the checkbox that Chip talked about that said, I forgot my MFA, or I don't have this device present. Like, what are your other options? And make sure that those themselves are secure, because that is not always going to be used by your user, right? The criminal sees that, they go, I have other options to get by.
Cool. So that ties into the next one. So passwordless, same thing as token-based MFA, common myth. This is put real eloquently. They ain't the same. So could you guys help educate and drive awareness on some of the key differences between passwordless, passkeys, and token-based MFA?
I'm just going to step out of the way and let Trevor dance here, because I think that he is passionate about this and the difference between the two.
Oh man, yeah. So I've heard this a lot. And honestly, this is totally an understandable mistake. I think we are very much in like a semantic era right now, where we're talking about how we're talking about things, right? Everything has like 6 different names. So somebody calls something a private token, somebody calls it a seed key. I mean, there's so many different ways of referring to this stuff. So a lot of it is just general misunderstanding of what these things are. So we're talking about token-based MFA. We're talking about something that creates a one-time use token, meaning it can be used one time on a very specific site or service, right? It's not like blast this out to everything you can find in Shodan and see what replies back with a 200. That is a very specific interaction between two things. When we're talking about passwordless, it's similar in that there is a one-time password that's created, but it's different in that you can still have MFA with passwordless, right? Those two are not mutually, or they are mutually exclusive. You can have both at once, right? So what passwordless is really is this a per site or a per service tokenized relationship where you have a public and a private key to create a one-time password for that service and perform that authentication. It doesn't replace the multi-factor authentication. What it replaces is that, like we were talking several slides ago, when we talk about the layered approach, it's really that first layer. It's that initial authentication. So they aren't the same.
Would it be, and maybe this is a one step too far, but would it be accurate to say that passwordless is really kind of a next generation client server security? So back when you had two certificates, right? You have a trusted device certificate that you deploy on a client to authenticate that device against an application. This is kind of making that kind of easier for the masses, is it not?
Yeah, it's like advanced PGP. Yeah, it is. Yeah. The strength in passwordless really is, it comes from what is stored publicly, right? So like even if we go back to like a traditional authentication, you've got a database on a server somewhere that stores a list of user credentials, right? You can have like an email or username, whatever, and then a password. And usually that's hashed and salted, and we feel pretty comfortable about that depending on how it's hashed and the randomness of the salt and other factors. But as we've seen time and time again, just because you do a really good job hashing and salting your passwords does not mean that somebody can't crack that. Spy Cloud, we do that, right? So what passwordless does is that bit of information, the user credential that's saved on that website is not a hashed password, right? It's not plain text at all. It is a public key. So it's part of a public and private key pair. And it's specific to that site. So if you really think about it, like if somebody steals that database, it's essentially worthless, right? Like that database contains data that can authenticate with itself, but that's it, right? You don't have the private key. You can't regenerate that. And you would only be able to use those public keys on the server that you already broke into. So that's really the strength of it, right? It minimizes the risk to like traditional data breaches, but it still is a relationship between a public and private key. So if you have both sides of that, then the security of that relationship is essentially negated. It doesn't exist.
So it's more secure. So passwords are more secure, but then would you also say that it helps alleviate some of the friction points in that user experience and how they access their digital lives on a daily basis? So a little more secure, but then also a little less friction for users with passwordless.
Yeah, I would even have a hard time saying it's more secure. I mean, it's a different kind of security, really. I don't think inherently it is more secure. I guess if you look at it as that trust relationship between a device and a single site, then you could make that argument. But really, it is for ease of use. I think, in my opinion, passwordless that is a solution, whether it's flawed or not, to the problem of people wanting convenience and doing things like using the same password on multiple sites, right? Passwordless enables you to bypass the passwords altogether. And by default, you're going to create a new password, right, for each site because it's baked in. So
it solves the problem of password reuse, really.
It does. Yeah, it solves the problem of password reuse. It solves the problem of, data breaches that we see, at least mostly. There's still some other parts to that. But it's still, we're still talking about authentication. Going back to what I said earlier, it's still access, right? And there's all this other stuff that's built around that is so much easier. It's almost kind of funny when we spend so much time talking about how, adversaries are going to be able to steal pass keys and they can regenerate it locally on their. All that is kind of besides the point, right? I mean, if an adversary is at that level, like everything else has failed. That's not going to be this. That will never be the first thing that they try, because there's so many other ways to get access to an account that are so much easier than going through all the pain and the heartache of being able to do that complicated process.
Okay, so going into the next one, forcing user password reset recurrently solves for poor hygiene. Another common myth, but the reality is, what have y'all been talking about the last 10 slides is convenience always wins, correct?
Well, back in my day when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was managing users in an IT environment, one of the things that we did was we had the rules in Microsoft environments. You can set all sorts of really cool rules, including forcing password complexity and forcing the number of iterations of a password that can be identical. So basically, you don't want somebody to continue to use the same password, or even like the next 2 times that they change their password to use that same password. So you can have memory in that. One of the environments that I worked in, that list of passwords that you had to have as unique was 12 passwords long. So over the course of, every 30 to 60 days, you had to change your password. That was a requirement. People actually had lists of passwords that were 12 passwords long that they knew and were variations of the root password that they just iterated through, and they would mark off when they had used them and would go back to that sheet when it was time to change their password. Forcing user password resets on a regular recurring basis does not solve for the poor hygiene process. It makes it an opportunity for users to be more creative, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Well, and sometimes users aren't even creative, right? Like one of like block number 1 to actor attribution is if you see a date in somebody's password, just iterate a few times. Go up, go down. You'll probably hit another password, right? Because that's what people do. Like names of the seasons, right? Like if your enterprise requires a reset every 90 days, well, maybe my password is going to be Trevor Summer 2022, and then the next it'll be Trevor Fall 2020, right? Like, this is what, again, users love convenience. It makes sense. We are human beings. Yep. Ease of memory, but if it's easy to remember, it's also easy to guess, and that's the part of the puzzle that oftentimes gets overlooked.
Right.
So for criminals, they don't care about cookies or sessions, right? But in reality, stolen cookies, as you guys discussed earlier, are highly valuable. And that's what enables the criminals to that access to that already authenticated session. So what do you think everyone needs to know about cookies and sessions, and why it's important to also consider that in this passwordless journey?
Yeah. These are so highly sought after. When we're sitting in these threat actor groups online, we're seeing actors talking about the things that they're looking for and the things that really are valuable to them. Cookies are consistently top 3, if not the number 1. The actors are so aware that this has become a very common TTP that we see. And we see it in big attacks. We've seen it in ransomware attacks. We've seen it in the lapses stuff that was happening a few months ago. They were using cookies to bypass the login process altogether, right? So, this is something that is well known in the criminal communities. There, like I said earlier, there are open source tools that have been built. They usually call themselves, anonymity browsers or anonymous browsers that will allow you to configure a session to look exactly like your victim. So, I know that this person, this is their display resolution. I know they are running Windows 10 Pro at this patch number, and their user agent string for their Chrome browser is this. And, you can essentially create an identical profile to the person that you're trying to emulate. And even things, like the geo filtering that a lot of MFA has been doing to try to identify anomalous activity. We see the criminals turning to residential proxies, and now I can just put in your zip code and select a residential proxy near you using the same internet service provider that you are. And then, combining that with a valid cookie and device information. I mean, it's functionally impossible for any automated system to detect anomalous logins using that kind of profile because it functionally looks exactly like the trusted device.
The other dirty side of this particular problem is the fact that even if you do know that session cookies have been stolen and they're in criminals' hands, there are not 100% of applications that have a means of invalidating those sessions. It's a very complicated, circuitous process to do that in most cases. And that's a struggle that a lot of our customers have run into, is even if they have that cookie information, if you don't have a means already built into that application to invalidate those session tokens and deal with that problem, it all comes to naught. And that's something I think that developers need to start taking a little bit more seriously as well, because it is so pervasive and it is so critical to the authentication piece. Having a means to do that's easy is something that should be part of the process.
Yeah, and just not to hijack this thread, but the other part of this, and something we haven't talked about at all, is the other means of authentication. So other than passwordless we have API tokens in our environments, right? We have webhooks that we use, and if you think about what those are, a webhook or an API token, really it is access. It is a means of authentication. If I use my personal access token to my GitHub account, I can go and clone that whatever repository I want down using that token. I don't have to log in. So that token in and of itself is authentication. And the other problem that we see with tokens and webhooks is when we talk about time to live, I mean, sometimes those things never even expire, right? You actually have to go in and revoke them yourself, or as an enterprise, you need to roll your tokens. Otherwise, those things basically never expire. And we've all heard the horror stories of people accidentally, leaving an API key in code that's pushed to a production environment, or accidentally pasting it somewhere and it being found. I mean, these are things that we know and the criminals know as well. So those tokens are also highly sought after for the same reason that cookies are, and everything else that you can bypass an authentication or perform a legitimate authentication.
So for the last one with passwordless, it was in May when Google announced that passkeys were available for their consumers for self-adoption, nothing for self-adoption available, and for enterprises to fast follow soon. So the other myth is that users are quick to adopt new technologies. And reality is each tool has its use cases that will continue to persist it. What are some examples, either in daily lives or in tech, where we've seen this long, lengthy process of adoption and understanding for tech?
So my favorite quote here is, it's a mechanics quote. I don't know who this is attributed to. Maybe I hallucinated it like ChatGPT, but the 90% of problems with the car are directly a result of the tool between the driver's seat and the steering wheel, right?
Yep.
It's the human being. So the same is true in tech. We have the same problems. You can build the most fantastic encryption algorithm that is, it'll take 17 billion years for Hashcat to crack it. User enters password 1234 one time, your encryption method is gone, right? So, this has been the case for a long time. There was a CISA report that came out a few months ago, if I recall correctly, that we're talking about, the top exploited vulnerabilities in 2023. And I think something like 2 or 3 of the top 5 were from 2012, and so people won't patch their vulnerable systems in over a decade. I have a really hard time believing we're going to get to wide industry adoption of something that is, requires extra user activity, quite honestly, overnight. Chip, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that users are incredibly sensitive to any change that could potentially impact their productivity. And that's one of the reasons that they're resistant to change in technology and means of doing things, authentication, and it's definitely part of that. I used to get asked this question about passwordless, and if that was on the horizon, what does that mean? And a lot of what we've covered today has definitely been part of the answer that I used to give. But the example that I gave was that we still have pencils. Right? You think about, we have computers, we have pens, we have all these other means of actually recording information, yet there are specific instances and use cases where pencil is perfectly suitable for a job. And the pencil's been around for a very, very long time. It has never been replaced, although it's had, tools or capabilities that are good replacements for it. And that's true for passwords as well, as passwords will continue to be pervasive. They're a fundamental, they're a home root for authentication and access, and that's never going to go away, regardless of how much technology changes. We're still going to have that pockets of places where passwords are still used.
On a spectrum of like fear or comfort, where do you feel something like this sits in? Or same thing in the context of ChatGPT, where people will either embrace, get excited, test it out, and that other spectrum of like really terrified it's going to steal my job level. Where does something like this for passwordless sit within our current space? Or
I mean, I'm not super concerned, honestly. I think, we exist kind of on this continuum of security versus convenience. And you can kind of think of this as a weighted measure of like which side will win out. And that's an overly simplistic way of saying that. But really, in my opinion, it's always going to fall on convenience. Like convenience, especially anytime we're talking about like user experience, convenience will always win out. And that doesn't mean that security isn't thought of at all. Like companies develop with security in mind all the time. But if it comes down to, is this something that will inhibit our ability to gain new users, the answer is always going to lend itself to convenience. So I personally am not all that concerned. I do think it's something that we need to think very critically about, and we should be having these discussions. That's why I really enjoy participating in these kind of discussions now, because I think if we talk about this early, we can develop really, really good ways to address this in the future as we do see adoption. But definitely not afraid that GPT-4 is going to all of a sudden become the best researcher in the world and I'll be without a job.
Yeah. I think that users are very focused on what they need to get their job done. But I think one of the things that changes the landscape a little bit in terms of the security versus convenience equation is all fundamentally founded on people becoming a little bit more aware of privacy implications. And the security tie-in there is, if you're working for a company, you may not immediately think about all the security risks for that company. But the second your personal information and your family is at risk, or other sorts of things start to kind of become more pervasive, changes your mindset. And that change, where you live literally, is definitely something that expands into the enterprise as you become more understanding and aware of the security risks of not adopting new ways of doing things and focusing on things. And I think that that's something that's interesting. It's certainly been an evolution that we've seen accelerating over the last several years.
Do you think advancements in technology take enough into consideration about human behavior and thinking forward, like how will they use this? How will it impact them? Will they be, and that kind of whole angle, or there's still room for innovators, technology vendors to bring more of that human element into how they advance certain areas of security?
Well, a fundamental element of product management, or good product management, I should say, is to take into account how people are actually using the technology. Because if you don't understand how people are actually going to be doing something, you can't really build in all the catches that are going to become critical to doing it the right way. And that requires conversation. It requires watching users, spending time with users, and really understanding that fundamental problem. So I think that it's a little bit on both sides, right? I think that there's certainly, great new technologies moving fast and taking us into the brave new world, but they have to take into account the way people are actually going to use them, or maybe even more importantly, misuse them.
Okay, so on that note, with everything tied around credentials really evolving into access, if you wanted to check your exposure and see what that looks like, we recently launched Check Your Exposure on spycloud.com. Free tool. All you have to do is provide your business email and see where your company or your personal risk is at. And we wanted to say thank you for hanging out with us and having this discussion around busting myths in our passwordless future. And have a great day.